Okay, welcome everyone. Uh, I don't see any. All right, cool. Okay, excellent. Welcome everyone to the Red Pill Religion Podcast. This is Andrew Stratalities. I have a wonderful roundtable to discuss virtue in pop culture today. I will go ahead and go down the list in alphabetical order. First is my new friend Clarissa. Go ahead and say hi. Thank you. Next, we have an old Thomistic Roman Catholic friend of mine, Monty. Awesome. Then another new friend of mine, Susan. Hey, Susan, can you hear us? Go ahead and go ahead and say hi, Susan. That didn't come through yet. Yep. Awesome. Not a problem. And finally, we have another member of Red Pill Religion, Dunstan. Awesome. The chat says that the sound is a little low, so I'm going to go ahead and put up the audio capture and see if that fixes it. So, today we're going to be talking about virtue in pop culture, and I know that me and Monty are big into nerd culture, so that's probably going to be our key things. Susan has been purposely aiming at Christian uh, um, movies and such over the last past few decades. And so it's going to be a really interesting conversation about virtues in pop culture. So, oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. I've seen at least half of Game of Thrones, so I'm more than happy to discuss the lack of virtue there as well. So we might have a bit of audio problems still, but I'll continue on and hopefully they'll get better as I continue tweaking OBS. But I guess the key thing, just for the people that don't know in the audience, is to maybe go over what are virtues. The way that Christians generally break them down are into seven virtues. The four classical ones are wisdom, righteousness, courage, and temperance, which roughly translate into making right decisions, doing right by other people in your life, and acting righteously towards God, others, and nature, self control to stay away from temptations, and courage to meet challenges. Then there are also three theological virtues, which are hope, charity, and let's see, it's hope, charity, and faith. Yes, wisdom and prudence are two English words for basically the same virtue. Sure. What word does she use to describe it? Okay. So Phronosis?
Yeah, yeah, like a phronema. They'll talk about like the phronema of the church, which is just like the mind of the church and the priests to be able to determine what a good Christian would do in certain situations. Yeah, like phronesis or phronema. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I think that's it.
cool.
Next, but that's going more into the technical details between the two words and their history. So anyway,
Yeah. But basically, virtue is the fundamental thing to get everyone. It's the development of the human character to the point where they need um, and meet the needs of being a flourishing human, and that's basically what virtue means.
Yeah, and that goes into virtue ethics also, as opposed to um, deontological ethics or a teleological type ethic, correct?
Yeah,
Yeah, or
that's right.
utilitarian ethics.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I should have said utilitarian. I shouldn't have said tell us because I think virtue ethics
would be a
is, yeah,
teleological.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. With its the right, the final cause, or being the exemplification of those virtues.
Yeah, and because of that, the it actually ends up being very important in stories because the virtue is actually the character of the individuals in a story. And so their motivations and their aims illustrate the moral character of both themselves and the actions that they take.
yeah. We can see like that uh, the character doesn't have virtue in mind when they make the utilitarian decision to just do what's best for the greatest number of people, right? When
Mhm.
it's um, when something might have bad consequences, but it's still the right thing to do. But often in pop culture and even our in our political society, the intuition is just like, no, we need to do the greatest good for the greatest number no matter what. And Christian virtue, Christian ethics would reject that.
Yeah, and Kant put it. And I disagree with what a lot of Kant says, but Kant put it this way that humans can never be used as means, but always as ends.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and actually, a great character that sort of exemplifies this sort of Christian hardline ethics that I know of, and we can talk about this a bit, is actually Captain America. Because in the various Avenger movies, Captain America always has the moral straight edge that he always follows. And it's actually
Yeah.
causes conflict both with Tony Stark, who's Iron Man, and Black
Mm.
Panther, because they don't have that moral hardline.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that makes sense from what I've seen from the Avengers and Iron Man. Oh yeah, very
You,
interesting.
you, you know what? You just mentioned Captain America, but let me ask you this, Andrew. What about Superman? Would that be, synonymous or analogous to Captain America? His type of ethics?
Yeah, especially in the more traditional versions of him, where basically Superman is a fundamentally good person who has superpowers and is never going to cross the line and is always going to use the minimum amount of force and so on and so forth. Actually, my favorite versions of Superman are basically where he's a good Methodist boy who's on his way to achieving Christian perfection and just so happens to have superpowers.
Yeah. Let me ask you this: if Superman is a good Methodist boy, what would Blade be?
That's a very good question. Blade has a much more ambivalent character and morals, right? So he hunts vampires and protects the innocent. But he's sort of like the Punisher in that sense, or some of these like avenging angel characters,
I,
who have no holds barred against the villain, but protect the innocent.
I think he may, in this, please, my Catholic friends here, don't take this the wrong way, but Blade might be a Catholic.
But in the defense of Blade, though, you also have to consider that the all the enemies are kind of considered thoroughly evil, right? There's really no sort of redemption to be had there. They're only to be stopped. So in a way, Blade is kind of justified in his go all out against them sort of actions.
Yeah, that's right.
Because
I
essentially,
want to object to that. That's the Catholic ethic.
I mean, in a sense, it is a Catholic ethic. For humans are potentially
Sounds
redeemable.
more Calvinist to me. Like everyone's total depravity.
Totally.
Like no mercy for them.
Well,
But yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, in the Blade movies, there are human characters, and there is more of a leniency towards them. But as far as like the actual vampires, there's no leniency. There's just heads gotta get chopped off right now, kind of attitude.
So that's an interesting question.
I mean, I guess there's some history in the Catholic Church where they did like burn heretics because they were, seen as, dangerous to everybody. So I guess there's some precedent, but yikes.
Well, the question is a vampire still ontologically human?
That is the question. But I mean, as far as
No,
story
because vampires
wise,
aren't mortal. So
Well, I was thinking about this. A vampire is, the very notion of a vampire is very influenced by theology, by Gnosticism, right? Do y'all see a link there?
Well, yeah, like this desire for immortality and like youth and that stuff. But I guess, I mean, the way that most vampires are portrayed is that they like hate the fact that they're immortal and they wish that they could die. At least that's what I know about vampires from pop culture. But yeah, I don't know.
well, if we take it further back to Bram Stoker's vampire, like the ideal vampire was based on as an anti-Eucharist symbol, right? Because whereas the Eucharist gives life from Christ, the vampire has to take life from people's living flesh, and then and then likewise on the cross, Christ gives us life, right? But the vampire, his life is taken away when a wooden stake is stabbed through his heart.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah.
So in a sense, the vampire is, at least historically speaking, from Stoker's perspective, the vampire is the Antichrist, literally.
Wow.
So the vampire is always the enemy. The vampire is always the symbol of Satan incarnate, as it were, because he is Antichrist and he is anti-Eucharist.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, that kind of brings up something that was on the poll that Andrew did about what was the on the poll, what was the second highest vote count for, Andrew?
Oh gosh,
I can tell you that in a second.
Yeah, thanks.
Archetypes.
Yeah.
Yes. The vampire is an archetype, right? And you see all these archetypes in comics and in popular culture.
Yeah, essentially characters or certain groups of characters stand in for themes or ideologies or certain perspectives of life, and they interact with each other and they either fail or succeed, or they're in a progression of succeeding or they're in a progression of failing.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll use comics because I know that relatively well. But like a lot of Superman is Hercules, right? He's a modernized Hercules, and similar for Batman, he's a modernized like Ulysses. And these types of archetypes do persist, and the vampire is an example of an archetype as well, of someone who um, preys on the innocent to sort of gain power themselves.
When I think of archetypes, I always come to mind Lord of the Rings, where
Yeah.
many of the different characters represent, it seems to me, a facet of Christ, or has a lot of Christian imagery and symbols
Yeah.
and so forth.
We have to say though that they're only facets, right? Because Tolkien explicitly rejected that there was any, direct allegory. I think he had some kind of distaste for allegory.
He had a great
Yeah.
distaste of allegories, so much to the point that he disagreed with C.S. Lewis on his
Yeah.
allegorical story. He's like, no,
Yeah.
that's bad. I'm doing this the right way.
Yeah, but there's certainly like, facets of. I mean, how can you resist? I mean, if you're a Catholic author, the values that you place into each character, right? Like the what are they called? The dwarves, like desecrating nature and just chopping it down just for fun, like that is clearly seen as something bad and not Christ-like, and you're gonna attribute that quality to someone that is a bad sort of character in the novels, right? Dwarves aren't, or not dwarves, not dwarves,
Goblins.
yeah, goblins. Yeah, I'm thinking of like little things, but I guess goblins are pretty big things, but yeah, you know what I mean.
In the defense of Tolkien, though, I'll say that the reason why he was so opposed to that type of writing, or just general characterization, is that because you only get like a one-sided view of it, and in Tolkien's defense on his character, his characters are more what's the word? They're more prolific in their actions. Like like the dwarf comparison was wrong, but there is an interesting note in the I can't pronounce it. The-
Silmarillion.
Yeah, that where the creator of the dwarves, he kind of brings the dwarves about without telling the creator god, and the creator god finds out, and he's like, "What have you been doing?" And like all the dwarves are like shivering in fear behind their master, and he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, whoops, my bad," kind of thing, and in the end, like the dwarves take on that actual kind of perspective of their personal creator, where they're more inclined towards like I'm sure that they do in fact tear down trees, but it's not so much for the intention of destruction as the goblins do, but they do it for the intention of creating things.
Yeah, craft, right? And I think
Yeah.
Tolkien did have this appreciation for craft, and you see that in the elves, and and their appreciation for nature, of course. But I mean, Gandalf is clearly seen as a kind of Christ figure. Frodo is seen as a kind of Christ figure. Oh my gosh, we should talk about virtue with Sam. Like totally
Yeah, definitely.
selfless and self-giving. Like, and then at the end, he's apparently supposed to have like this huge family and stuff, which is also a kind of charity. Well, I mean, actually, in medieval art, charity is always depicted as like a woman with lots of children. Yeah, I mean, then Sam and Rosie have this like massive family, but Sam lived his whole life in service.
Unpopular opinion: Sam was the hero of the trilogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of
He's the character
humility.
that we're supposed to be, right? Like he's the one that we're supposed to be striving to be like. Always self-giving and stuff, and he just was super humble and just wanted to, smoke a little, smoke the pipe and go
What
back
was
to
in that
gardening.
But what
And-
was in that pipe? I mean, okay. No, but I think he exemplifies the, he's just a mere gardener, and
Mhm.
he takes the task, and he serves as an assistant to Frodo. So that's a great representation of what a Christian should do: humble service.
Yeah, absolutely. And then at the end, he's like this, a sort of, magical gardener. He's able to restore the natural world that had like been destroyed in the Shire, right? From the gift from Galadriel, the soil or whatever. So
Yeah.
they live happily ever after with lots of, pipe stuff. What is that called? Pipeweed? I don't know.
Pipeweed, that's right.
Oh yeah, pipeweed. Okay.
To the love of all 1960s hippies.
It's The correct verbiage is called cigaweed.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There's
But I
also
mean, it was always like this well balanced kind of thing. Like, yes, they like to have some beer or whatever they call it, and like to smoke a little bit, but it's not like they like spend their whole day doing it. No, they're like, let's go work in the garden. Let's spend time with friends and family. Let's talk about history and lore, and like, actually just
Yeah.
build nice relationships with each other. Yeah.
And showing that nothing in and of itself is bad. It's just when you do excess of something, you know.
Mhm.
Anyway,
there's
I-
also oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
There's also a it's not really expounded upon as far as I can tell, but it's something that I noticed with Sam, is that he carries a Marian theme about him. Much because Sam is never the central character. It's always Frodo who is the
Mhm.
central character, and as you pointed out earlier, Frodo bears the Christ-like symbolism.
Yeah.
He's the priest, whereas Sam,
He's
in my
he's
view-
utterly obedient, right? Just like
he's,
Mary is.
he's utterly obedient. You don't really hear about him a lot. He comes into play at key points, but other than that, he's kind of on the side. You don't hear about him. You don't really know that much about him, until those points where where Sam is there to help Frodo, and like in a similar way, in the Gospels where Christ is at the wedding of Cana, and they have no wine, and what happens there? It's not Christ who actively does something. It's Mary. Mary goes to Christ and asks, tells him, we don't have any wine. Can you do something about it? To which Christ gives the explanation, and then goes and turns the water into wine. And the same way, Sam is there, and he helps to pick up Frodo in these moments of despair, like when he gets caught by the what's it, like the spider's name?
Sheba?
Sheba?
Sheila? I don't know.
Yeah, something along those lines.
Oh, the
And then-
Shelob.
Yeah, Shelob.
Shelob.
And then the other thing is that like another central Marian theme is that it's Frodo who leaves for the new lands, and it's Sam who stays behind, much like Mary does. Christ ascends back to heaven, and Mary stays behind with the apostles.
Interestingly enough, there's an epilogue, and apparently Sam also at the very end of his life follows
Yes.
Frodo.
Yeah,
And so
that-
it's like, oh, it's totally like the assumption.
yeah, that's the assumption right there.
Oh my goodness.
And like that's not really a theme that I see people talk about, but it's a theme that I've noticed.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen anyone talk about it either. You should write something up.
I sh-
I was just thinking of this. Do you think it's fair to look at it as the different characters as different portraits or facets of the church? You may have more service-oriented people like Sam, or warriors like just so on. What do you think of that? It's a depicting of the church, and the church has many different members, but they're all in one
Some more
body.
corrupt than others, yeah. but but yeah, I mean, I think that's fair that each of them has their own. I mean, each kind of people in the narrative has their own sort of gift. I mean, I want to express some caution though, because some of the warriors, they took pride in war just for war, right? Like it was like a sport, and I think that that's something that Tolkien wouldn't approve of, and it's those characters that were more tempted by the ring, for example, wanted to possess it for themselves and use it.
So, if we're
Yeah, something like that.
discussing Christ-like characters in Lord of the Rings, we can't forget Faramir, who is
Yes.
yeah.
who seems to me to be the most Christ-like character. And for those who don't know, Faramir is Boromor's brother, and Boromor is the one who's
Yes.
really tempted to get the ring, but Faramir isn't tempted at all, and he basically falls in love with the Shield Maiden character. I forget her name.
Oh yes.
Um,
Arwen.
No, not Arwen.
No, Eowyn.
Eowyn, yeah.
Yeah.
And the big thing with him is almost gets sacrificed by his father, and there's
Oh my goodness, yes.
this sort of redemption of the line that is in Faramir, because unlike his father and he's of the they're like they're the substitutes, right? They're the prime minister line, right? Not the king, the line of the king, which is
Yeah.
but the prime minister line, and he sort of redeems them by not going after the ring or seizing power. And of course, there's a big thing with the sacrifice, which is very Christ-like in its typology.
Yeah. And then
Yeah,
Eowyn, who he ends up with, she was tempted by like glory and honor, and she wanted to be with Aragorn. But then she decides, you know what? No, I actually do love Faramir, and I'm gonna be with him. What was I thinking? I don't want to be a queen. Um, like she wanted to like die in glory and honor, and then she realized, oh, after that was like put in front of her, and she was like, what, not as great as it seemed. She's like, oh, actually, Faramir is amazing, and we're gonna live happily ever after.
yeah. The biblical imagery is striking, and I think you can look at it from a number of different perspectives.
Yeah, definitely, and I think that Tolkien succeeded in basically making a mythology or a legendarium that is deep for the English-speaking peoples, as deep as anything that came before, or that these other cultures have, be they Finnish or Icelandic or Russian or even Mediterranean. And I think it's also especially appropriate that it's fundamentally like Christian, or compatible with Christianity or influenced by Christianity. Since England is actually, or Britain specifically, is the oldest Christian tradition outside of actually Bible lands, and it took root there, um, right after the crucifixion, along with it taking root in places like Turkey or Rome or even ancient Palestine.
Hmm.
Should we
I
talk
think
about some unvirtuous
Yeah,
figures
definitely.
in pop culture?
Sure. It's
Sorry to change the subject. If
no,
someone wants
no,
to
no.
ask something,
This
go
is
for it.
great.
Okay.
Well, as opposed to be a little bit more charitable rather than saying unvirtuous, although it is, perhaps more along the lines of what are modern archetypes of virtue?
So are
you
we
know what?
contrasting modern types with Christian types?
Yeah, or Christian
Okay.
or classical archetypes.
Okay. Okay.
I have a good representation of modern virtue that maybe something expressed in Star Wars, where you get a mix of Christian virtue, combined with pantheism and Eastern thought, and all of it together, and you kind of just get a complete mixture there.
Can you give us an example?
Someone bail me out. I
Sure,
can't think
sure.
of-
Han Solo is a great example. So Han Solo is a rogue, and he eventually redeems by aiming at something greater than himself, but sort of keeps this very modern sort of bad boy persona. And then one that's sort of this Eastern type thing is Yoda, actually, right? That Yoda is probably a Western interpretation of what an Eastern virtuous monk would be like. Where he's about forming the next generation and engaging in sort of this jujitsu against the evil forces rather than meeting them one on one, right? Because like Saint George kills the dragon, which is sort of one of the strong archetypes in the West of how evil is defeated by direct conflict, while Yoda is all about changing things. And Luke, actually, Luke in his relationship with his father, I think is sort of the key Christian virtue, because through love, Luke is able to redeem his father, and through sacrifice, his father is able to redeem himself, roughly.
Well, thank you. I was just about to say that. Appreciate that. Also, I just wanted to add, becoming one with the Force is like a pantheistic Eastern thought. It seems to be, very strong, a very big element in Star Wars. So that pantheism, as opposed that New Age type thinking, as opposed to the Christian virtues.
Yeah, not only with the pantheism angle, but there's also a materialistic angle. Like they kind of bob and weave between saying that the Force is some supra natural energy, to saying it's found in nature as well, and it kind of comes in and out between those two things to give like this vague sense of spirituality, but that it's based on materiality instead.
Yeah, and I think that's just fundamentally a flaw in their legend making. To use another example, let's go ahead and chat a little bit about Game of Thrones, right?
Ooh, yes.
Because in my opinion, the Stark patriarch, I forget his name, the one that dies very
Ned Stark.
Ned Stark. He's like the one that I think is articulated as the most virtuous, at least in the beginning. But his virtue, at least in the television series, is tied with an extreme naivete. And I think that's one of the key ways that virtue is looked at in the modern world, as naive, as opposed to in classical times or the Christian virtue, where it's not tied to this sort of naivete that can be taken advantage of.
Yeah, and I think that there's this interesting mix of like our modern understanding of what good is, like with utilitarian ethics, and the sense of like, we need to redeem people and liberate people, and like you see this in Daenerys, where she builds this great following by doing increasingly worse acts, right? And towards the end, well, you said you only watched the first half, Andrew, but at the end, she's like just now killing innocent people for power. And the idea, I think, that the writers wanted to convey is that power is like it's inherently corrupting, and the person who ends up being the sort of, well, who ends up becoming the next person on, well, there isn't a throne at the end, but the next king of the 7 kingdoms, basically, is someone who has absolutely no ego, has this prolific understanding of like history. You get Bran, right? But yeah, I mean, Daenerys is kind of the person that the Christians should really have a problem with throughout the series. Of course, along with this incestuous relationship between Queen Cersei and her brother, but that's another story.
Yeah, and that's sort of the thing, right? Is one of the things, and I know like Arthurian legend pretty well, and it's roughly the same type of thing, or it can be compared to Game of Thrones, and in the Arthurian stories, the kings have power and there's corruption, but there's the redemption, and redemption, usually through Christ or through religion, is a very key part of it. Like with the Fisher King, right? That the Fisher King is this king of this land, and he is wounded, and his manhood and virility is wounded, and the infertility of the land is due to that. And it's only through redeeming him in this very Christian way that the order is restored, and the fertility in a very broad sense is brought back. And that's definitely not the theme of like Game of Thrones, where it's basically the primary theme seems to be power corrupts. Absolute power is really neat. Um, to paraphrase a joke about it, but basically that there isn't any fundamental order that needs to be restored, or if we do, it's only something that's very temporary that occurs, um, and
Yeah, that's the idea, I think, behind this, that breaking the wheel, monologue that Daenerys gives. She thinks that she's able to break the wheel and restore order by basically reinscribing the wheel herself. And the only person who's actually able to break the wheel is someone who's not interested in power at all, which is Bran. But I think a lot of people didn't quite understand what was going on there at the end. Everyone seemed pretty shocked by the ending, but I thought it couldn't have happened any other way.
yeah, and I think that part of it is we have a modern tendency to put the wrong archetypes onto people, right? That in some sense, I think a lot of people, or a lot of the audience, sort of just identified with Daenerys because she was powerful, um, and as opposed to identifying with Ned Stark or even the Starks because they were virtuous and getting screwed over. But that's a interesting thing, and I don't know if that happened in classical times and it just hasn't been preserved like the other things, or if that's like something that's wrong with our modern culture.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I
to-
mean, could you just tie it to like original sin? Has this sort of desire for power always been around and it's a part of human nature, or and people just knew it better before?
Yeah,
Or
I think that's a reasonable way to look at it, right? Because um, eh, the stories that have been persisted are the ones that actually tell sort of a deeper truth, more deep than people want power and people get power, or and then do bad things with the power, but understanding of redemption and all these other things.
Yeah, it does seem to me that a lot of these different philosophies, materialism, humanism, atheism, they don't have a real understanding of redemption, of how a person can grow. They tend to, if a person makes a mistake, beat that over the head with them, but they don't give a person the opportunity to grow. Um, yeah, so I see that. One thing I do see in as opposed to maybe 30 years ago in the sitcoms, today it's there's a lot less family type sitcoms, and you have a lot of things that are kind of sexually explicit on MTV and so forth. I'm thinking of Road Rules and I don't know, The Bachelorette and these different things. Back in the 80s, or before then, even you had like the Andy Griffith Show, or Family Ties, or Who's the Boss. You had a show with a moral ethic that seems to teach or have taught virtue. Not so much today. It seems today you have a decline. The further we get out, the less.
TV just seems to be like, well, the people what they.
And it's also, it's not just shaped by sex or more sexually explicit things on TV, but it's shaped by this radical individualism. That's how I like to phrase it. This radical individualism, this Me Too mindset, this political correct culture that we're living in. It just wasn't like that when you had more of a ethics or virtue taught, or a culture that was shaped like that back in just 30 years ago. And I see a stark contrast to that today.
Well, I'll put it a little differently, that the default philosophy of life in sort of pop culture is this enlightened hedonism, rather than aiming to be like a saint or a sage or to be an excellent person, but it's rather to, sort of in an enlightened and long term strategic way, gain as much pleasure as possible. And I don't really know the exact causes of it, and it seems to have degenerated over the last few hundred years. I mean, and there's a little bit of oscillation, right? The Victorians, for all their problems, at least advocated virtue, um, and these classical stories do too. But it's sort of, I guess the other fascinating thing is in modern pop culture is it seems like we're now getting writers that all they grew up with were these inversions of things, right? So they got exposed to anti-heroes or what have you, or inversions of these really traditional tropes of virtue, and now all they can do is the inversions, and it seems like almost every thread of action hero, it's basically the good guy and bad guy arguing about whether or not good guys and bad guys really exist, and then blowing things up, as opposed to having a clear understanding of forces of evil and forces of good.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the Dark Knight with the Joker versus Batman, and the narrative is exploring the idea of like what is goodness and what is badness, and the Joker just wants badness for the sake of itself. So he really is a good kind of. But yeah, I mean, Batman is sort of tormented in his own ways, but.
Yeah,
Well-
exactly, and I think that's actually a very detailed look at it, especially the Dark Knight trilogy, because in that society, and the really interesting thing is there is a understanding of goodness in the citizens of Gotham, right? So one of the things that the Joker gets really mad at in the Dark Knight is the bombs that he sets on these two boats. And there's this great scene where one of the prisoners says, "Give it to me, I'll do what needs to be done," and he takes the thing and he throws it out the window.
Yes. Excellent.
Yeah,
Excellent.
he did what the other people could not do. Yeah.
Yeah, and the Joker just thought like this is unbelievable. Like there was no world in which this actually could happen in his mind, and it did. And I think I don't know, maybe the Joker was like, man, I really am messed up, I guess. But yeah, I think of what that one policeman tells. Is it Batman? He just says, some people just want to see the world burn.
Yeah,
Right?
that's
After he like lights up. Yeah.
yeah, that's Alfred
Gordon.
actually.
Okay, yeah. But yeah.
Well, let me just answer something. I think why our culture has degenerated, and I think increasingly so in the last, 50 years or something. I think the sexual revolution in the 60s and the rise of, even though the verification type movement that in philosophy and the rise of Christian philosophy, even though that has taken place, there's a general skepticism that still abounds with our young people, and it's portrayed in culture. You have a postmodernistic mindset which is skeptical of anything virtuous, or anything tied to antiquity, including Aristotle, and so anything that is tied to virtue, there's a general skepticism. I'm sorry, I was kind of hogging the thing, but do y'all want to pick up on that?
Sure.
I don't have much to say. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a key thing there is the dominance of thought with skepticism and things have actually pushed philosophies of life, and philosophy of life in total, as the sort of crowning glory of philosophy to the side. which
Yeah, oh, sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah, postmodernism just like is a rejection of these grand narratives, um, and which would include grand narratives of what the good and bad are and how history works and things like that. And with that comes skepticism, you know.
There,
Yeah.
there's also something. I want to kind of take it back to the Joker and the
Mhm.
Dark Knight. But I'll bring it back over here towards the skepticism. It's these underpinning philosophies, like in the Joker's kind of monologue against Batman, where he's telling Batman, um, I'm doing basically what everyone else would do if they were in a position like I am in. I'm just taking what everyone else thinks just that one step further, right? And what the Joker here is kind of underpinning is Jean-Jacques Rousseau's theory on the social contract, right?
Mhm.
We're in we live in a society, right? So because we live in a society, we live under this social contract. I won't hurt you, so you won't hurt me, right? And what the Joker has essentially done is saying, I am not abiding by this contract.
Yeah.
And because I'm not abiding by this contract, I'm not held to any of your standards. And then to Batman, he's essentially telling Batman, um, I'm outside the law because there is no law for me, and you're hindered by the law because you accept the law. And that makes me more powerful than you are. And with like a lot of these modern archetypes, their understanding of virtue always underpins some kind of philosophical understanding, like with skepticism. Since the normal skepticism tends to be along the lines of, well, I don't know what's true specifically, but I know that, say, for example, material things are true. So what happens with that is, these more spiritual things are tossed to the side because you can't trust them 100%, but you can trust your senses 100%. So then you have these characters whose personalities grow from that into more of a kind of individualistic, I just need to do what I can do to be successful kind of.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And that's why I think we need to teach virtue again. Maybe have a civics class in school. I don't know the answer, but there, this generation is really missing on basic knowledge of what the virtues are, what our history is, and so forth.
Yeah, I just don't think it would fly today in today's culture because of the disagreement about what is virtuous. The traditional Christian ethic, for example, like if you read any natural law stuff, which is tied up with virtue theory, of course, but it'd be against gay marriage and homosexuality, like homosexual sex and things like that. And it's like, you can't teach that in public schools. Like that's never gonna happen anymore, or like sexual ethics just generally.
Because if
Yeah.
you keep your pants on too long, you'll eventually die, right?
Absolutely, yeah, just combust, right?
yeah. Well,
Spontaneously.
and then the other thing is there are a lot of people that reject very vehemently in almost like as a principle that human life could be teleological in any sense.
Right.
And
Yeah, that's just been rejected by modern science, even though it's saturated with it in its language. But
yeah, and
Oh, well.
and that's the thing. Even if it might be a useful constraint on natural science, it is not a useful constraint on ethics.
Yeah, and it's not a constraint on lived life. I mean, we live as though final causation and Aristotle's causes were true. That's how we live.
Oh, there's so much I could say about that, but I think that would take up too much.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things to talk about too, but I'm like not going to.
Yeah, so we're about at the top of the hour, so this is a good time to sort of have capstone closing statements. So I'll go ahead and go last. Uh, Anyone have a final thought?
I think, yeah, this is one of my favorite things to talk about too, but I'm like not going to.
Yeah, so we're about at the top of the hour, so this is a good time to sort of have capstone closing statements. So I'll go ahead and go last. Anyone have a final thought?
Oh man, just putting me on the spot there. Capstone closing statement. Give me a second.
Sure thing.
I guess I'll go first. I'm very happy that we're all here. I hope to see all of y'all back next week. I think this has been a great discussion, and it really helps. I mean, I just encourage everyone in here and anybody who is listening. Let's look at the virtues once more, and let's look at the things that got us to today: prayer, contemplation, God's word, and church tradition. There's a reason why history, why we're here today and how we got here, and we just shouldn't throw everything away in the sake of, political correctness or individualism. I think we should be thankful we're here and look at the past in a humble way, just as Frodo and Sam, all the various characters through fiction have. So that's my closing.
Yeah, I'm just happy that I get to participate in this. And although these talks aren't happening in public schools, it's nice that we're taking to like modern technology like podcasts and YouTube and things like that to discuss these things to make them more widely. So thanks for having
I'd like to thank Andrew for letting me be on here because I love the sound of my own voice and talking about philosophical topics here. Yeah, and I could go into more here, but that would take way too much time. But if anyone is interested in talking about this outside or any listeners listening in, my handle on Twitter is Philo Monty, and you can always hit me up with questions. People always do, as it is. So if anyone's wants to discuss more on this, I'd be more than willing to talk about it.
Awesome. Again, I want to thank you all for coming and joining us on this discussion. You guys are incredibly sharp, and this has been a wonderful and very valuable conversation. And I hope that I'll be able to have lots of conversations like this with you guys in the future. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. And we will end this with a quick prayer, and then we will go off air. Grace be unto you, and peace from our God our Father, and from the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.